please don't make this mistake. Everyone is saying that SOSO no Frieren is something that it's not. Well, at the very least, they're not telling the full story. So let me explain why they're wrong and why it's actually worth watching. Also, should go without saying, but this video will contain some minor spoilers. Now, there are already videos out there saying Frieren is depressing and Frieren is about when all your friends are dead, which is true in a way. Frieren starts out like many fantasy stories. Frieren, our main character, is an elf mage in the party that just defeated the Demon King. Her party members are a dwarf warrior, a priest who, incidentally, has a casual drinking problem, and Himmel, the hero. A literal hero, you know, like Dragon Quest. Anyway, this is where chapter 1 starts. But then it skips forward about 50 years or so, which to Frieren might as well be 50 minutes considering elves can live as long as 3,000 years. But to her party members, it's the end of the line. The first member to pass is, of course, the hero, which doesn't face Frieren until the funeral when it suddenly dawns on her how little effort she put into making the time she spent with their friends matter. She didn't bother to ask all kinds of questions and learn who they are on a deep level. It's this weird moment that has this kind of double meaning depending on their perspective. See, for the other members, they're like, wow, we spent 10 years together. So they don't cry at the funeral because they spent a long time with Himmel and they know he lived a full life. But Frieren doesn't cry at first because it doesn't occur to her, until she's like, oh my god, I only spent 10 years with this guy and now he's dead. It'd be like if you met a friend that you really got along with and then they died like a month later. That's the difference in perspective, and it's why this is much more tragic for someone like Frieren. So this is why when people are like, oh, Frieren is so depressing, you have to check it out. I'm like, well, you're technically right, but at the same time, those people are technically wrong. Because this, at least as far as I've read, is about as depressing as Frieren ever gets. As a matter of fact, the story takes on a different tone pretty much right after this chapter. There are depressing moments where we see the other party members and how their adventure is over, or we'll meet a character that's an orphan, or a character that dies. But those kinds of moments are outweighed by the other moments where the characters are goofy and carefree. Frieren is a great example of this because when you first meet her, you get this impression that she's sort of this wise old wizard that doesn't really care about anyone or anything. But soon you realize that she's really more like a teenager that kind of just goes at her own pace without any kind of big plans. She wakes up at noon every day, she'll make this cute little smile whenever someone does something funny, she knows like half the spells in existence, but then she'll walk into a dungeon like, dude, I got this, and then gets eaten by a monster 2 seconds later. She's really just out here vibing, and the same goes for the other characters. Her apprentice Fern comes off as this super serious character, but she's really just very polite and kinda reserved. She ends up developing this dynamic where Frieren mentors Fern and nurtures her, but Fern will wake Frieren up in the morning, make sure she's dressed, make sure she looks both ways before crossing the dungeon. You think it's gonna be these two depressing characters, but it's these two sisters just going on quests and vibing. And this is where I differ from people who are like, oh, Frieren is depressing. It's not depressing. It's just quiet. You know, like, there's sad backstories, but there aren't any epic deaths, and there is some action, but it's a small fraction of what goes on. Most of the plot is just Frieren and the other characters going on quests, finding cool stuff, meeting cool people, and just taking the time to be like, you know what? Life's pretty cool, man. But now, at this point, you might be worried. Like, okay, if it's not this heartbreaking fantasy that everyone's saying it is, and all the characters really do is walk around, then why should I bother reading it? What is it actually about? Well, the short answer is that Frieren is a story about one of the more undervalued aspects of any fantasy story. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, like I was saying, Frieren is about something that audiences and even writers often overlook when it comes to any fantasy story, whether it be books, movies, or even games. Basically, Frieren answers this question: what comes after the adventure? See, I might have given you the impression that the first chapter is somehow misleading or unimportant, but that's not true at all. I just meant that people like to take it out of context or point to it for the wrong reasons. The first chapter is very important for setting up the story, and it's just like I said. For the most part, Frieren is dedicated to exploring that very simple yet very deep question: what comes after the adventure? And it does this by using a number of recurring themes. There are 2 ideas that are common throughout all of them, those being time and memories. But there's a bunch of different ways they're looked at. For example, one scene most people like to talk about is this one where Frieren and Fern have to defeat this big demon. She previously sealed the demon when she was with Himmel. At the time, the demon knew this super big spell and nobody really knew how to deal with it. But decades later, this demon's spell is just a basic attack spell, and every mage and their mother knows how to block it with a defensive spell. As a result, Frieren is able to one-shot the demon who used to be one of the biggest threats in the world. The whole point of this scene is to show readers that time moves on. Now, in some cases, this can be a bad thing, like in the scene if you're the demon, but in other cases, this can be a good thing. It's not inherently good or bad, it's just inevitable. Which is important for our setup because it shows us time and time again that you can go on your quest to slay the Demon King, or you can develop this super strong spell that makes all of humanity fear you, but time moves on. There will always be something that comes after, and you have to accept that. Which is another area Frieren really explores, this idea of how time is spent. For example, there's this one flashback where Frieren and her old party are exploring a dungeon, and Himmel explains how he makes it a priority to explore every nook and cranny. Frieren's like, well, the dungeons will only get harder, so it's not like we can do this forever. To which Himmel says that he'd rather enjoy himself while he helps others. That he wants the kind of adventure where he does all kinds of cool things, and then happens to complete his quest at the end of it. In other words, Himmel's ideal adventure is one where he lives for the moment rather than for the end goal, which ties into the previous theme of time moving on. Because think about the games you just speedrun through versus the games you take just a little more time to explore before the end game. In retrospect, you probably like the second kind of games better because you took the time to enjoy everything the game had to offer. And it's the same thing in Frieren. There are some characters who end up sad and lonely because they devoted their life to this one thing and then that was it. And then there's characters like Himmel who enjoy the little things and are able to look back on their memories after the adventure is over. And this is the kind of stuff you get into Frieren for. This is why the setup of Frieren is so important, and it's how this story is able to set itself apart from so many other fantasy series. Because there's two sides to adventures. There's the quest, and then there's the here and now. One of the ways I like to explain it is like this. There's this one character Frieren meets. He's also a priest, but he's been in his hometown forever, and he's never gone on that adventure he's always wanted to. He tells Frieren it's too late, and then he thinks to himself, why now? Why go on a big adventure here and now? And Frieren just tells him, because now is all there is. It's the simple answer, but it explains everything. Now is all we have. So the next time you're playing a game and you're like, should I talk to this NPC? Just go for it. The next time you're like, should I really start this manga after all this time? Do it now. Because if you don't do the things you want to when you can, you won't be left with much later. But if you take the time to enjoy the little things, you'll be left with so much more. That is what the adventure is all about. And that is why you should really check out Frieren. But now I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think Frieren is really about? Was there something I missed? Share your thoughts and say what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my video on Undead Unluck. In it, I explain why Undead Unluck is so underrated and why it's personally one of my favorites. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.